Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome back to the Wade Center Podcast. I'm Jim Beitler, the director of the Wade Center, joined as always with co-host Aaron Hill. And today we have two very special guests with us, Julia Golding and Malcolm Guite. They're here to talk about their new book, Wardrobes and Rings Through Lenten Lands with the Inklings. And Simon Horobin is also one of the authors. Simon was on our podcast June 16th talking about his book, C.S. Lewis's Oxford. So if you want to hear from Simon, make sure you go back and check out that episode. But Julia Golding is a multi-award-winning novelist writing for adults, young adults, and children. Over 1 million of her books have been published around the world in over 20 languages. And she's also the director of the Oxford Center for Fantasy, a small educational charity established to honor the life, work, and faith of the Inklings. Malcolm Guite is the former chaplain of Girton College, Cambridge, and author of various books on contemporary spirituality. As a literary critic, he's written an acclaimed book on Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Mariner, and he's also an expert on the Inklings, Tolkien, and C.S. Lewis. Thank you both for joining us. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
So how did this project come about? It's a very unique book. It's not just a selections of passages from the authors, but there are reflections that are written by each of you. There's scripture interwoven with it. It's about a theme. Can you talk just a little bit about how this project came about and how the three of you ended up working together on this project?
I think I should probably kick off on that one because I was the sort of instigator of it. It had a rather...
It's the chief conspirator, as you would have been.
Yeah, I'm merry in that context. Yeah, so what happened was that I, at the time, went to the same church in Oxford as Simon Horobin, which happens to be a few doors down from Tolkien's house in Northmoor Road. And the people at the church, which is a very lively church, they knew I was interested in Inklings. I wouldn't stop talking about them. And one of the assistant ministers said, why don't you and Simon do a Lent course about the Inklings? So we ran a Lent course, a live in-person one. And for that, I put a lot of work into it. I went to various scholars to get little bits of video to drop in.
Wow.
And Malcolm was the standout star of that process.
Of course he was.
Yeah. So going forward to about a year ago, I was thinking we've got all this fabulous material and I really want to put something positive out in the world at this point.
Good time for that.
Yeah. So, and Simon, I already knew was on board, but we couldn't get it over the line with any publisher. And I thought, I know, we need a star player. We need to bring on to the field our striker. And that is Malcolm. And Malcolm, what did you think when I sent you the email?
I feel I should be wearing a number 10 shirt here. But, yeah, well, this was great. And actually, it was a kind of, it was not only, I mean, as soon as you got in touch with me, I thought, well, this is a great idea. And I can see how this worked. And I'd had fun doing my little bit. I just did one session, I think, of your Lent course. But, you know, there's plenty more in the locker. But as it happened, I owed a Lent book to Canterbury Press, who are my poetry publisher, but for whom I've done both Lent and Advent books. Well, it wasn't going to be, in fact, it wasn't necessarily going to be a Lent book, but I had dreamed up, and it's still on my back burner somewhere, I had dreamed up a book based on some sessions I did in a church in Cambridge called Christ Across Five Frontiers, which is about how Christ never stays on the safe side of any dividing wall we make for him. He's always showing up, you know, both in his life and ministry, but also in her. Anyway, I got stuck with it because I ended up having to do this philosophical bit about difference between the subject side and the object side. And I just got stuck. So I was occasionally being sent nagging letters. But one of the things they'd said was, if you don't want to do Christ Across Five Frontiers, why don't you do some kind of Lent book on Tolkien or Lewis? And then out of the blue comes Julia's proposal. It fits absolutely perfectly. So I wrote to Canterbury Press and said, how about this? How about we have the dream team, you know, and we bring Julia and Simon, and they're already working on this. Can we present this to you? And they practically bit our hands off, didn't they? So I have to say the thrill for me, I mean, maybe we'll get onto this. Obviously, to some degree, we could, you know, Julia was not only the chief conspirator, but the kind of architectonic mastermind in terms of the shape of the whole thing. So we kind of divided things up and had assignments. We worked on them separately. separately. We emailed them. But, and for me, this was like the best thing on the rider for my contract. We met at various points in Oxford, in Magdalen College, in New Building, not actually in Lewis's rooms, but in Simon Horrobin's rooms, which is just kind of down the corridor. And there was a point when we would bring all our stuff and mutually critique each other's work and tweak things and read out loud what we'd done. And at one point, Simon walked in with this enormous pot of tea for us. And I thought, do you know, this is exactly what Lewis and Tolkien
That's so great.
and Barfield were doing a couple of rooms down the corridor, because on the Thursday nights, he always made a really big pot of tea. So I felt like we had a good vibe going there.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's a special book, and I love the title. And like, once you put wardrobes and rings together, it just all of a sudden makes sense. Of course, like, this is about Lent. Like, there's a way we're passing through, and the way through is suffering.
And the
way
pilgrim
through.
journey. I mean, the pilgrim thing
Yes.
is so strong. Also, I mean, there's a paradox, you know, in Lent. In one sense, you know, people think about giving up things for Lent, and that's a right and proper thing to do if you give up something that's not bad in itself, but if it's a little dependency with chocolate or alcohol or whatever it is, and then you use that as a prompt. No, instead of depending on this, I'm going to pray to God. I'm going to remember that man does not live by bread alone, as Jesus says in his own temptations. But so there's this kind of outwardly denying thing. But actually, almost everybody that does that for Lent, or has some kind of practice or time set aside, find it incredibly refreshing. And the two places that my mind went to immediately, if I'm thinking about Lent and, Lewis and Tolkien, and luckily I managed to bag these and write those particular ones. One is the lovely moment when Lucy reads the spell for refreshment of the spirit in the house of the magician. And I mean, if you think of a spell as a spell of time, I'll be out for a little spell, you might see the whole of Lent as a spell for the refreshment of the spirit. And then the other one, of course, which I wanted, was Lothlorien, because, that's to me to be the great place of refreshment. Anyway, I've gone on too long, but I was delighted to be doing it. And it's so much fun to collaborate, because you're bouncing ideas off people. You read their stuff, and their stuff inspires you to the next one you write and stuff like that.
I mean, likewise, I also got some of the things I really wanted to cover. So I really wanted to cover Eustace and the Undragoning.
Yeah.
Which I found one of the most profound spiritual lessons I've ever read anywhere. It stayed with me all my life. But also I wanted to tackle the problem of Susan, which I managed to get in right. We got a Holy Week section, and I felt that fitted quite well with C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces. So I looked at it in that context. And I think it was also important that I was in the team, because the Inklings lack a female perspective. So I kept putting that in all the time. But also,
well, Dorothy says as well.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I kept parachute, let's not forget the other half of the population. So I think that worked out very well. And Malcolm, I particularly, I was editing a lot of this, putting it together to send off. I was like the one who accumulated everything. I really enjoyed reading everybody else's things. Simon and his sort of medieval perspective, Canterbury Tales, Beowulf, but lots of expertise on Lewis in particular. And I love Malcolm's chapter on Puddleglum and is it Plato?
Plato's Cave, Puddleglum and the Republic.
Yeah, that's everybody will really enjoy reading that day, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, Puddleglum's a favorite character. No, so it was. I have to say, it was a labor of love. But I must say, I would love to sort of hire Julia as sort of ringleader stroke taskmistress, because she kept us all in line pretty well.
Yeah, I would call myself wrangler. I thought I was more like a wrangler. Yeah.
So this is the sort of herding cats things, poets and academics. But I found it really useful to have another person kind of reminding me what I needed to do and when, and and then editing and collating. So I think Julia probably did the lion. If I say she did the lion's share of the work, of course, the lion himself really did the lion's share in terms of getting us all together. But
there is just a lovely structure to the book, and it's kind of organized thematically. So, like one of the first sections is about nature. Yeah. And then there's this, I love this section on time and wizardly wisdom. I think that's a great kind of collection of elements. Would you be willing to talk a little bit more about one of those sections that you find really compelling and why you chose kind of it thematically to fit for Lent?
Well, Julia, you chose them, so.
Yeah, well, when I do Lent each year, I like to use it as what Malcolm was saying, a spell for refreshment. It's like the palate cleanser, the setting, setting yourself right. And surely that's what the 40 days in the desert is for Jesus. It's not just suffering, is it? It's actually about him meditating and working through his mission to come.
Yeah, and priorities. Yeah.
Yeah, praying and sort of, he's got a massive thing to get his. Who can imagine what that process was like? But we, in our own little ways, have that chance each Lent. So the one about time, which you've picked out, I think is particularly good with both Lewis and Tolkien as your sort of interlocutors with the Bible as well. So, for example, I really enjoyed thinking about those beings in Tolkien's world who live for a long time and how they see the universe. And so Legolas as the elf. And here's some beautiful things he says. He doesn't speak very much in The Fellowship of the Ring. He's one of the most silent characters. But at the end, he gets this amazing... This is the end of The Fellowship of the Ring, not the whole trilogy.
Yes.
He says this wonderful thing about time being like a river. And they're on a river as he says it. And it makes you feel about, well, how does God look at time versus us? Because we are just ripples in that stream. And so I was using that to meditate on the nature of time and sort of dipping into the more sort of Boethian idea of where God is in relation to this, but in hopefully a very accessible way. It actually started with thinking about my daughter who went to the London Planetarium when she was about 7, young, in a school trip. And when all the lights went out and they said, the universe began, I think at that time they were saying 13 billion years. It's changed since then, but 13 billion years ago. And it will end. And my poor little girl went, we're going to die. Because she didn't realise the perspective is like billions of years still to come. And that was the first time she realised we were all going to die. And each of us have a moment like that, don't we? When we sort of think, yeah, there is eternity, but there is also our finite place within that.
Yeah, I actually was a really fruitful theme that Julia set for me as well, thinking about the nature of time. And because we were thinking thematically, it meant I suddenly put together two passages from two completely different C.S. Lewis books, both of which I love and know well, but I'd never sort of seen the link. So in the Screwtape letters, one of the letters is just about time. And it's got this, it's really brilliant. It's the 15th letter, I think. And it goes, Screwtape, of course, this is all from the devil's perspective. He writes to the younger devil, he says, the enemy, i.e. God, has put these creatures into time, but he has destined them for eternity. So they're always going to feel this. And he says he wants them to pay attention either to the eternity which is to come, to their final state, of heaven or hell, or he wants them to pay attention to that part of time which nearest resembles eternity. And he says that part of time is the present moment. I mean, here I have to say Lewis is quietly riffing on Boethius. Boethius is trying to describe eternity not as an infinite succession of minutes. Boethius in the Consolation of Philosophy says he uses beautiful Latin phrase, very poignant, kind of punchy. So he calls eternity a nunc stans, a standing now, an eternal now. You never, time is never stolen away from you. You have the full of it. So it's a nunc stans. So in the letter, Lewis says the present moment, nearest resembles eternity because it's the most real. And he says this, for the past is frozen and no longer flows. And the future actually hasn't happened yet, so it's not real. So the aim of the devils is to get people either uber nostalgic about the past and spend all their attention on moral energy on a fabled version of the past, and never have any time or energy or morality left to love God or love their neighbor, because the only place you can actively love is now. It's no good saying somebody, I would have loved you in the past if we'd met. And equally, he says the other way to tempt people is to have them fixed on grand futuristic schemes. So they're always going to be happy and they're going to be kind and the world is going to be charitable. But right now they have to do these terrible things to make the perfect state appear or whatever. That way, there's nothing left for the present. So that's very practical. But then Lewis does this brilliant thing. I mean, he puts the poetry into the mouth of his devil because when he says that, he says the past is frozen and no longer flows. And then he says, but the present is all lit up with golden rays. The present is the point at which time touches eternity. Now, that's pure mysticism. It's wonderful. Anyway, I remember hearing the late James Como, who speaking in Romania just a few days before he died, his time on earth, and he was pleading the case for Lewis as a mystic as well as all the other things. So there's a mystical moment, and I just used to think of that as the one place where Lewis had written about the importance of the present moment. But I reread The Great Divorce in the course of this, and I realized there's a fantastic passage in The Great Divorce when the man with the lizard on his shoulder is trying to put off the moment, say, well, maybe I won't repent now. Maybe I could go away and think about it and come, it's the constant procrastination. It's St. Augustine in the Confessions saying, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. The angel says to him, there is no other moment. There is no other time. This moment contains all moments. This time contains all times. It's now, literally now or never. And I found that not only beautiful, but incredibly challenging. Because I'm exactly the kind of person who's tempted to live in the past and saying, like, why was I not in Oxford in the 40s? Or, why was I not a mate? Like, I would so have got on with Keats and Leigh Hunt. Why wasn't I born in the second generation of the Romantic poets? Or why wasn't I a contemporary of George Herbert? I'm always tempted to do that stuff. And I have to be brought back to the real time. It's only up to us to do what's given to us in the time that's given to us. So the call to be present became a huge theme for me. And I really rediscovered it in the course of working on that section of the book.
That call is so difficult. I find that incredibly difficult as well. Are there specific ways, and this is maybe even more practical, are there specific ways that you both kind of live into the moment, like specific things that are helpful in that regard?
Well, you mean life advice?
Exactly. I want life advice.
I think that, I'm a bit like being a poet. Being a novelist means that you live in the present of your piece of fiction, your artwork a lot of the time. And for me, that is very close to a meditative state, that I am separated from the cares and the worries, and I am fully present in the work. And I suppose what I like to do in my life, if I can, is bring that same attention to God and to prayer and to my spiritual life. But it's much harder, because it is so much else in the airwave. And I think what I've learnt this year is the value of just turning up.
Yeah.
And so, for example, in my little village I live in, which is very much like Hobbiton, we've got a small church here which has the problems of being a sort of older congregation, the typical late stage Anglican church issues. And so I've been talking about doing a fellowship group all year. And then just suddenly I thought, I'm just going to have to say the doors are open. Come. Obviously I checked with the vicar first, didn't do this without permission. I do believe in structures. I don't want to offend anyone. And it's worked really well, and people come. And we've also, another group has started a sort of contemplative prayer first Thursday of the month. So if people turn up, you start to build your faith community. So I'm thinking about building it not just as an individual, but in community. You start to build. And we can have lots of good ideas on the drawing board, but sometimes you just have to say, right, let's go. And if nobody comes, I'm going to be on my own praying, but that's fine.
Yeah. What you just said there, Julie, about turning up is so important. I always think one of the strangest but kind of wisest things, in Paul. I mean, it seems like a real paradox where he says, your bodies, which is your spiritual sacrifice. And that seems to me, he's just saying, if you can do nothing else, show up in church. and at least give that time to God. And then it's amazing what he can do with it. Yeah. So this thing about how do we stay in the present moment, especially if you have a very active mind, which flies out all over the place. So I do find, and this is an old Christian tradition. Some people think this is only to do with kind of Zen or Indian mysticism, but it's, what they think of about becoming aware of your breathing, sitting still. George Herbert, in his poem Prayer, and you don't get more full-on Anglican Christian than Herbert. Herbert says that prayer is, and this I quote, he says, it's God's breath in man returning to his birth. And I think what Herbert is saying is, if you just sit still, and as you breathe in, you think, actually, God is breathing into me. I'm like the atom. I'm, the person he's made, and he breathes into. And then you breathe in for a bit, and then you think, oh my goodness, I've got to let my breath out. One day, as we all know, thinking of Jet, it'll be my latest breath. Who's going to help me do that? How can I trust? And you're with the first Adam breathing in, and there's Jesus beside you now, and he's on the cross, and he breathes out, and he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So I can breathe in with Adam, my biological life. I can let my life go with Jesus with his last breath. But that's not the end, of course, because on Easter Day, Jesus stands with the disciples, and what does he do? He breathes on them, and he says, receive the Holy Spirit. So I can engage with my whole story of creation, fall, and salvation and new life just in a few breaths while I'm waiting for an Uber. I just breathe. I also use poetry for this. I wrote a poem which is sort of an address to myself about how to do this, called The Singing Bowl. And the opening lines are, and again, it's about the opening lines of this poem are, begin the song exactly where you are, remain within the world of which you're made, call nothing common in the earth or air, accept it all and let it be for good. And then it goes, start with the very breath you breathe in now, this moment's pulse, this rhythm in your blood. That's a good place to start. That's incarnate prayer. And we should never be ashamed of praying with the body, especially not at Christmas time, because this is when God, there used to be a song on our charts back in the day called Let's Get Physical, which I thought was
Olivia Newton-John, wasn't
should
it?
have been a Christmas number one, really, because this is what God does when he comes down to
That's
earth.
right.
But bringing us back to the Inklings, I mean, they're also notable for turning up for each other
Yes.
for quite a long time for a writing group. I know all good things come to an end, but they did turn up. And then that thing about breathing, I think we've discussed this, Malcolm, that one of the most beautiful scenes in The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe is when, of course, Aslan, after he's resurrected, and he goes to the White Witch's castle.
Oh, yes, and he breathes.
And it breathes on the statues, and there's a description of how they come to life again in a reverse reverse of the Medusa. They turn back into flesh after having been turned
that's
to
sort
stone.
of Pentecost in Narnia, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the other thing, of course, on breath in the Narniad, which is a really profound meditation, is when Jill and Eustace are born on the breath of Aslan from his own country back to do their task in Narnia. And they kind of float on his breath, and they don't even know they've gone over the edge of the cliff because they're carried in the breath of the lion,
Well, I think Jill sort of by mistake pushes him over the edge.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about the devotions during the actual Holy Week? Jim and I were talking about this earlier about how the book sort of zooms in during that time period, which, happens during Lent. You look at our calendar, our Anglican calendar, it's like, all of a sudden there's something every day that we're doing at the church. Can you talk a little bit about how you selected the themes and the passages for that? And then specifically, I wanted to call out that there are a lot of mentions of the Ransom trilogy, of the Space trilogy, and you start out Holy Week talking about with passages from Out of the Silent and Perelandra. What were the reasons for including and starting Holy Week with that, and just talk in general about Holy Week and how you guys zoomed in and expanded time almost to slow down during that period?
Well, we were guided by our resident chaplain in the choice of the themes for each day. And so we were following the different stops on the route on that week. So for Maundy Thursday, for example, which is about service, we've got a focus on Sam, which Simon has done. And the obviously when Jesus turns towards Jerusalem, I've got a reflection about Gandalf coming back to finish a task on that day. The Palm Sunday one is another of Simon's contribution. It's a shame he can't be with us, but he's too busy being the modern day C.S. Lewis in Magdalen College. So, but there is so much in the Ransom trilogy, which it's obviously much less popular than Narnia. But as reading it from a faith perspective, there's so much there.
Oh, yeah.
About salvation, what role we play in salvation. And so he is looking at particularly how Ransom is summoned to Perilandra to be their he finds himself being a kind of Christ-like figure or
He's
a
a sort of
messenger.
Christus, yeah.
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 And that's what we're looking at in that.
Yeah, that's that sense of being called to. The thing about slowing down time and bringing in the focus, I mean, all we're doing there is following the Gospels. All 4 Gospels are covering, if you like, 3 years, sometimes more, of Jesus' ministry. But almost half of each Gospel is just the last week of his life.
Yeah.
Sometimes more than half. So they knew, the very earliest Christians knew, that this week brings everything else into focus. All the great themes are enacted out there. I have a very strong conviction that the more we walk, like imaginatively walk with Jesus through the events of that week, the more that allows him to walk with us towards whatever our Golgotha is, that we have to deal with, our own cross to bear. So there's a lot of that. I mean, my own little contribution to that was Holy Saturday. And that was an interesting one because it's a day that people don't quite know what to do with. Everybody knows what's happening on Good Friday, and everybody knows what's happening on Easter Sunday. It's partly because we've lost the medieval thing about that he descended into hell and that he's dealing with all the dark stuff, and that's one way of doing it. But another way of thinking about it is I think I called my piece Pause, Poise, and Turning Point. I think it's quite good that after, like, if you're an Anglican of my type, you go to a 3-hour devotion on Good Friday and probably an evening service as well. And then on Easter Sunday, you're up at dawn, and then there's a thing at 11, and then there might be, so you've got loads of corporate church activity on the Friday. And then Saturday, all that is on is usually the children are invited into the church to make an Easter garden, and you might or might not be part of that. So this sense of a poise, and I was thinking about it, and I suddenly thought, it's an extraordinary moment in the dramatic narrative as the pace quickens towards the end of The Lord of the Rings, when they're finally getting to the brink of Mount Doom. And then there's, literally Frodo and Gollum struggling. And do you remember, there's a dramatic description in the other part of the story of all the captains of the West at the gate. Mm-hmm. They've defied the mouth of Sauron. Battle is about to commence, and suddenly everything stops. And Gandalf even raises, he says, wait, stop. The entire fate of everything and everybody is now about to be determined, This is not a time to start tweeting your friends or taking a call or typing a text. This might be a moment just for stillness.
Yes.
And then it all happens, and the deliverance happens. So I'm kind of glad. So that's what I wrote about. I wrote about that extraordinary moment, and I quoted the various bits. But I think we kind of liturgically have that offered to us. We don't get the whole of what Good Friday is about on Good Friday. We only really understand what Good Friday was about on Easter Sunday, when we see the wounds glorified. So I think it's good to have this moment where you're almost teetering on a brink. As literally Frodo and Gollum are teetering on a brink.
I think that was one of the days reading somebody else's contribution, which I found really inspiring. So I would recommend it as a reader to look forward to Holy Saturday. And for those of you who are or perhaps your memory of Lord of the Rings is best through the films, which is many young people, they actually do that moment really quite well in the film, because it's literally the ring is floating on the lava.
Yes.
And the music is swelling, but is this thing actually going to be destroyed? And it lights up. It's a fantastic moment, I think, in a cinematic way of conveying that pause that Malcolm's talking about. I should point out, we did do 3 days together.
Yeah.
We thought there were 3 readings which we couldn't toss a coin over. And that is, we wrote together for Good Friday and we wrote together for Easter Sunday, which is the resurrection of Aslan and the field of Cormalin, which is what happens after when Frodo and Sam wake up after they've been rescued. But we also, people might be interested to find out, we also shared that wonderful conversation between Frodo and Gandalf. I wish this didn't happen in my time.
Oh, yes, that,
Yeah.
and that actually picks up the time theme. I mean, we could have used that earlier on time and wizardly wisdom. But in a sense, that passage, those words of Gandalf's, which have now become, Tolkien would never have been able to have imagined that they would become like one of the most widely shared internet memes.
Well, we actually land on them at the end of that week of
we do,
Time
yeah.
Wizardly Wisdom, and that's why it falls there, because it sums up really the wizardly wisdom of
Absolutely.
the many things that we might want to say about time. And I use that as when I look at the world and think, why is all this happening? The answer isn't, well, yeah, but what are you going to do with that time that you're in?
Yeah. I wish it hadn't happened in my time, so do all those who live through such times, but it's not ours to ask. Ours is only to know what we do with it. I love that phrase, the time that is given us.
Yes.
I think the word given is really significant. To receive time as a gift rather than endure it as a burden or expect it as a right. There's another Screwtape letter where Screwtape's asking the younger devil to make a big deal out of the annoying irritations and seizing of what he so fondly calls his time, because he has to stand that actually, all time is God's, but he gives us time. There's a weird new sculpture, which is also a clock, that appeared in Cambridge about 10 or 15 years ago, outside Corpus Christi College, which is called a chronophage. And chronophage in Greek literally means time eater. And it's this huge locust-like creature. It's a clock, and it's devouring the time. So as the big thing turns, like the...
Oh, wow.
When this appeared, I wrote a sort of meditation, which we had in our parish magazine, because we're very close to this. And I said, Christians need no longer fear the chronophage, the years that the locusts have eaten, because now we have, and I invented a new Greek word for fun, now we have a chronodor, a time giver. And I suggested that we should have an imaginary separate monument beside it, in which we have all the spheres of the world, and an angel from God is perpetually pouring the stream of time into the world as a gift for us. And that would be a kind of counter-imaginal to the chronophage.
The book is, thank you both. The book is called Wardrobes and Rings Through Lenten Lands with the Inklings by Canterbury Press. I wonder if I just might ask 2 final questions, one for each of you, about some of the other things that are going on in your lives. Julia, you work for the Oxford Center, or you direct the Oxford Center for Fantasy.
Yeah,
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Just to sort of put a coda on what you just said, we also have recorded the book. So if you like to listen to, each of us have recorded our chapters.
Oh, wonderful.
And you can get this on Audible. So do look out for that.
I think our listeners will love that.
Yeah,
I'm a huge audiobook follower, so we must do this because that's how I tend to read often.
That's another great thing that Julia organised for us, and she sent us our marching orders, and I sat in Winnipeg on an American trip and recorded my readings and sent them to Julia.
Yeah, I'm quite scary. You can hire me if you want me to organise your book project.
I was going to say, it sounds like I know who to call if we need to get something done.
Yeah, I'll do it with a smile, but I will organise you. Yeah, so the Oxford Centre for Fantasy, it was my COVID dream. I've moved out of the centre of Oxford, but at the time I was living right by C.S. Lewis, Tolkien's house, in Northmore Road, and it went up for sale. So I thought, well, let's try and buy it, as one does. And so I started a campaign, but if you give charitable money, it's not returnable because of the tax thing. So I thought, well, it was £4 million. We might not raise that. So if I do fundraise, what am I going to do with this money that will honour this effort? And so I thought, well, there is no creative centre for Tolkien and Lewis and the Inklings. There are like the physical Lewis house, of course, but really they're huge. Their fantasy, in fact, is huge, and there was nothing obvious that actually celebrated that. And I thought, okay, that's what I'll do. That's going to be my goal. Set up a centre in whatever way. We didn't raise the money to buy the house before a private person came along with £4 million down the back of their sofa. And so we instead have set up, thanks to some wonderful folk who live in the same road a few doors away, they've given us to run our centre the top 2 floors, which we have decorated to reflect mainly Tolkien cultures. So there's a dwarf room and an elf room. And
Oh, wow.
in the summer, I stayed in the orc den, which is like the little room.
Oh, wow.
And at the moment, there are 6 postgraduates and someone training for the ministry living there as Inklings. And the idea is they have a sort of experience of that, in present day Oxford. So that's a lovely expression of it. But a lot of the activity is online. So I run a podcast. Everybody has a podcast. I run a podcast called Mythmakers, where I talk to fantasy creatives like debut fantasy authors or more established authors, plus experts on things to do with the Inklings. Occasionally we dip into things like Harry Potter or Philip Pullman, but it's largely focused on Tolkien and Lewis. That's our USP. But we're not doing the scholarly version of it where we talk about different forms of Elvish. It's more about how does this inspire us to write now, because that's where I come from. And they were the 2 writers who helped me become a novelist. That gave me... We talk about this in the book as well, just plugging the book again, about the mythopoeia and the discussion about the nature of creativity and us as sub-creators. And that really is what I hope people who come along to our centre, to one of the writing courses online or come to see us in person in the summer, that is what I really hope they'll get out of it, that feeling of connection to the creative source that is the Inklings.
That's a resource for our listeners. Thank you so much. The Oxford Center for Fantasy and the podcast.
Yeah, Mythmakers is the
Mythmakers.
podcast.
Yeah, thank you. And Malcolm, you've got another big book release approaching. Could you give our listeners a little teaser for Galahad and the Grail?
Yeah, well, this kind of ties in with Julia's thing as well, because like Julia, I'm a person who's been hugely inspired by the Inklings and particularly Lewis and Tolkien, but also Charles Williams. And it was partly reflecting on what they have done about what's called the matter of Britain, the whole Arthurian thing, that finally prompted me. I heard the Arthur stories when I was a little kid from my mother. She told me really beautiful versions of them, which weren't dumbed down in any way, and they were full of the numinous and the beautiful, and the Grail was a very important part of it. And I noticed a lot of more recent versions have either secularized the story, or they've turned it into kind of paganism and taken away the Christian elements. And I thought the whole point about those Arthur stories was that they took, I mean, obviously it's very interesting. You have a wizard, possibly a druidical wizard like Merlin, and in Thomas Malory, he's having a conversation with the Archbishop of Canterbury about the miracle of the sword in the stone. I want to be part of that conversation, I want to sort of, so I think actually those Arthur stories were written in a way to baptize the imagination of pagan Britain and bring it into Christ. And many beautiful things find their flowering in that. Others have to be left behind, You have a good Lady of the Lake, but you also have Morgan Le Fay, and you have to work these things out. Anyway, I felt that it was time to tell these stories again, but I kept putting it off. Then the scholar Serena Higgins put together a massive collection of academic essays called The Inklings and Arthur, which was prompted by the publication of the Arthuriad that Tolkien began and didn't finish, his Mort Data. And once you open up the theme, you realize that, obviously Merlin comes into the Ransom trilogy at the end, Merlin Redivivus and Arthur and Ransom himself turns out to be the Pendragon, and all of that. So all the Inklings loved that. They all meditated on it in different ways. And Charles Williams particularly wrote poetry, Taliesin through Logos and so on. So anyway, signing off on, I wrote the final chapter of this massive tome. I wrote the conclusion, which involved, of course, reading all the essays. And it suddenly made me think, not, wow, didn't they riff on the author? It actually made me think, now I have to do it. You know, I thought to myself, there's some precedent for professors from Oxford and Cambridge suddenly writing long fantasies. This has been done before. Maybe I should give it a go. So I finally sat down a few years ago to begin my Arthuriad, which I tell in a kind of ringing, singing ballad form. So I hope that younger people can read it too, but I hope it'll have lots for growth. And it is literally an epic undertaking in the sense that, you know, an epic book, as Milton showed, you know, an epic should consist of 12 books. It should have heights and depths and gods and men and everything. So my 12 books are divided into 4 volumes, rather like Tolkien's 6 books are divided into 3 volumes in the Lord of the Rings. And the first of these 4 volumes is coming out in March. I'm beginning in medias res, in the midst of things, as Aristotle said. So I begin with the Grail, because I think that's the very heart of the whole thing. And then I go back in the second volume to the coming of Arthur, and then I've got a third volume about the knights, and then finally the passing of Arthur. So I am deeply, deeply immersed in this now, and I'm trying to not to travel to the States quite as frequently as I used to have a longer, because, you know, at a pinch, I can write a sonnet in an airport lobby, but I can't write an epic in an airport lobby. I'm having to have bigger blocks of time.
Sure.
But the other magical thing is that this wonderful illustrator, I wanted it to be a beautiful, physically beautiful book with lovely illustrations and illuminated capitals, something people could treasure, something they'd like to give to their kids or grandkids, something that could become a family thing, that they got out and read ritually. And it was good to touch and open and, absolutely everything the opposite of little handheld glowing devices. I wanted the full thing. Rabbit Room are publishing it in America and Canterbury Press here, and they've got... Anyway, I asked for my dream illustrator, and I actually got him, which is this guy, Stephen Krotz, who's absolutely brilliant and, actually deepening as we go along. And he and I had this magical quest, as it were, together. We went together to Glastonbury, we went to Dover, we went down to Tintagel, and they're making a film out of that journey we made together. It's going to come out next year, called Merlin's Isle. But he has illustrated it, and in kind of wood block engraved. I mean, it's just... I've just seen the first of the sort of special collector's one with a slipcase and everything. I haven't physically seen... I don't have it, but the sample was sent to Pete Peterson. So I have to say I'm really excited about this. But I'm also... Maybe I need to hire Julia to keep me going on my thing and get me... the things on time. Julia, you and I must have a conversation about this book on the fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the dream. The idea of working with an illustrator like that. So I'm going
I'd love to talk to you about that. I know Lewis loved Pauline Baines, illustrations. And there came a certain point where I think they were like partners in me. If I think about my reception of Narnia as a child, and I learned... There's lots of things in the Pauline Baines illustrations that aren't specifically mentioned in the text,
Yeah.
And I learned, she's as much a maker of Narnia for me as Lewis is. And the same goes for Alan Lee and John Howe.
Yeah.
I used to, before they had illustrated editions, I used to avidly buy every single Tolkien calendar when it came out. I've got them all, And then when finally they produced the big edition with John Howe's illustrations and Alan Lee's, I bought them immediately, because that's part of what I absorbed. So I'm hoping between now, 2 volumes will come out next year, and the 3rd and 4th in 27 and 28. So between now and 2028, if the Lord spares me and, I live to complete it, I'm hoping that this will be probably my last big thing. I mean, maybe I have to say, when I talk about USP, you mentioned the unique selling point of your USP was Tolkien and Lewis on the Centre for Fantasy. Well, I had to point out that the USP to the publishers, the USP for this is nobody has done a poetic version of this for 150 years.
Yeah.
But the unique selling point might turn out to be a unique sinking point. Why nobody... But I've had a very, as you may know, I have a weekly YouTube, which has got quite a wide reach, and I've read sample bits out to sort of road test it, as it were. And I have to say the response has been very enthusiastic from the thousands of people on the YouTube. So I am hoping that it'll sail rather than sink.
Malcolm, have you ever heard Lewis reading that passage where Merlin shows up in that hideous strength? Have you heard that?
No, is there a recording of that?
So we did a series of podcasts called the Lost Lewis Tapes, and we found at the Wade Center recordings of C.S. Lewis reading Perelandra, the chapter where he lands on Venus and he's floating on the water. And then the only other passage he chose to read from his own books was Merlin showing up at the house and the Pendragon and the whole thing. So it was clearly resonant with Lewis.
Yeah. No, so actually, I'll go just if we got a moment. So a key thing to my entire approach to why I wanted to write this poem in the first place is a conversation that takes place towards the end of that hideous strength about what Lewis calls a good haunting. And he sets up, he says, we've dreamed better than we can do. And he sets up what he calls modern Britain, which is the way she is now, and Logres, which was the kind of divine vocation, the spiritual England. And Logres is always in danger of being extinguished by Britain. But every so often a group of people find themselves together and breathe life back into Logres. And that contrast between Logres and Britain and that sense of awakening Logres within Britain is totally what my poem is about.
Oh, wow.
I have a line in the little prologue poem that says, listen well before you start. Be still ere you begin. See through the surface roundabout, the noise, the rush, the fear, the doubt. Though modern Britain lies without, fair Logres lives within. And it's wakening that up that my poem is all about.
I think that's available to Americans as well. The version, it shouldn't just be our little Britain. It's also
absolutely.
Yeah,
in
it's
fact,
for everybody.
In my appendix, the first I stole from Tolkien the idea of having appendices for the nerds, at the end, and I've got an appendix about all of that, in which I also talk about the relevance of this story to America and to Europe.
Well, thank you. We are so grateful for your time, Julia and Malcolm. Thank you for being on the Wade Center podcast. This has been a real delight. And we're going to check out Wardrobes and Rings Through Lenten Lands with the Inklings, as well as Galahad and the Grail. So keep an eye out for those to our listeners. And we will be with you next time. Thanks again for joining us for the Wade Center podcast. Bye-bye.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, past collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.